Hi, you guys. I am so glad to have you here with me today because I am starting something new today. I am starting a new series called Sewing Skirts with Anita. And this started out as a selfish project because I need skirts in my wardrobe. And I made a skirt recently. It's actually the one that we're sewing today. I made it in denim print and I absolutely love it. And after I sewed the skirt, I felt so good that I had actually made something that fills a gap in my closet. And I decided, okay, I'm going to sew more skirts. I'm going to focus on skirts right now. And then I thought, well, maybe I can create a video series for those in the community who are interested in sewing skirts too. So that's why I'm here. And before I say anything else, I want to give a huge shout out and thank you to those in my private email community for helping me to pick the patterns and being a part of this process. I appreciate you. I appreciate your interest, and I really do love that you took part in helping me to get this going. For those of you who are not part of the private email community, you can click the link in the description box below and go over to check it out to see what it's all about and see what the benefits are. I would love to have you join us. There is exclusive content for members only. There are exclusive giveaways for members only. The people who are in the group get to help me choose what patterns we're going to sew for some projects. So you can go check that out. Now, for this series, we're going to be sewing 4 different skirts, and I will release what those skirts are as we move along into the series. Only the people who are in the private email community know which patterns we're sewing, and they have advanced information so that they can prepare, so that when the video hits here on YouTube, then they're already prepared. They already have their supplies and everything they need to get started. So go check out the link below so that you can join the community too. Now, I have some information I need to share before we get started. Let's see, starting with the pattern, we're sewing Mccalls 7906, and it is available in sizes 6 through 22. Now, I realize that some of you need a larger or maybe smaller size. I'm going to highly recommend that you go check out BluPrint, and that is linked in the description box below also, because they have so many classes on sewing, different topics on sewing, and they have one called Create, let's see, it's called Create Any Size, and it's a video that teaches you how to grade patterns to fit your size. Now, they are a membership membership site, so you can join and become a member and have access to all of the videos that they provide, and there are many on different topics, not just sewing. But they also have individual videos that you can purchase, and this video is available, and I'll link to that one or the website in the description box below if you want to go check it out, and for purchasing that individual class. So I recommend doing that, or the other option is you can purchase the book called Pattern Fitting with Confidence by Nancy Zeman. And that's a book that I have in my library that I use to help alter patterns. I especially use it for my sway back adjustment, which I usually have to do with all of my bodices, and also for my waist to hip measurement. And it is filled with lots of other adjustments that you can check out. And she uses the pivot and slide method in her book. So check that one out. It's listed below also. Let's see, fabric choices. The fabric choices or suggestions on the back of the pattern are for medium weight fabrics. And I do recommend following that suggestion because the skirt is a full skirt. It has pleats and it flares. And if you use a thin, slinky fabric, you're not going to get that effect. So go with one of the suggestions on the back of the pattern. I'm using a European 100% washed linen, and I know linen wrinkles like crazy, but this is what I had in my fabric collection. So I'm using that fabric. The fabric that I used for the first skirt, I think I mentioned that already, was a printed denim, and I got that one from Joanne, and I will link to their page down below where you can see all of the different options for printed denim. Okay, make sure that you pre-treat your fabric before cutting out your pieces. Or just follow the manufacturer's instructions, the care instructions on the bolt of the fabric if you're purchasing in person, or if you're purchasing from a website, then when you click onto the fabric that you're interested in, they should have care instructions with all of the information for that particular fabric. Notions. We will be using a hook and bar closure for the top of our skirt. Now, a hook and eye is smaller than a hook and bar, but a hook and bar is more appropriate for closures where there is overlap because it's more stable and we need a little stability to hold the top of that skirt closed. Let's see, buttonholes. We will be creating buttonholes, and I know that many of you are intimidated by buttonholes, but with lots of practice, you can overcome that fear. I'm going to be using an automatic buttonhole foot that came with my Baby Lock Soprano, and that really does make it so easy. The buttonhole foot does all of the work for you. So if you have a buttonhole foot that came with, or an automatic buttonhole foot that came with your machine, I recommend reading your instruction guide to see how that works and give it a try. Just practice on some scraps of fabric that you're going to use for your project. If you don't have an automatic buttonhole foot, then I would suggest looking through your manual to learn how to sew buttonholes manually and just practice. If you practice, you will be able to do it. I know you will, so give it a try. For opening the buttonholes, oh my goodness, I have something that you guys are going to love. I love it, so I hope you will love it. It's a buttonhole cutter set, and I use this to open my buttonholes, and it is a breeze. It makes the process so much easier, much quicker, and I just love it. It has really simplified my buttonhole opening life, and I hope I'll show you. I'll demonstrate it when we open our buttonholes, and you'll see. That is going to be linked in the description box below also. And that brings me to my news. I have a new Amazon store. Yes, I'm so excited. Now, all the tools that I use, all of the resources that I use, everything, and sewing tools, the notions, the cutting tools, pressing tools, all of the books that I use, they're all in my store now, and everything is in one place, which makes it so much easier. So all of the supplies that I will be using for this project, with the exception of the fabric and the pattern, are in my Amazon store. So when I tell you that the link is in the description box below, you will click on my Amazon store and go to the page or the category for the item that you're looking for. So for instance, for the buttonhole cutter set, when you go to my Amazon store, you will click on the cutting tools page and you'll find it there. Okay, that's about it. I think I've covered everything. Yes, so we are ready to get started. Before we get started, I want to draw your attention to your pattern piece front, number 1. We have pleats that we're going to be sewing into the skirt, and it is crucial that you carefully transfer your markings from the tissue paper onto your fabric correctly. So go ahead and trace the pleat lines, and then if you're sewing view D, you're going to transfer the squares onto the line that you are sewing. And what I do, I don't actually draw a square when I'm tracing onto the fabric. I just draw an intersecting line in the center of that square. If you are sewing views C or A or C, then you're going to transfer the circles onto your fabric. And again, I just draw an X through the circle. Okay, make sure you take care of that. Then I'd like to give you a little tip of something that I do when I'm transferring these long lines onto the fabric. These are the fold lines. I cannot stand transferring these long lines. It's just too much work for me, and I don't like to do it. So what I do is I snip at the top and at the bottom on the fold line. So a snip here and a snip there, and then the same thing at the bottom. And then what I will do is I fold over where the snip is. Now remember, I don't have the line to follow, so I fold over where the snip, making sure that these raw edges are even at the top, and then I'll take my seam gauge and I'll measure. And then as I continue down that edge, I'm folding over and measuring to make sure that I have the same width. And then when I get to the bottom, the snip is already there, so I will just fold over, making sure that the bottom edges are even, and then measure to make sure I have the same width all the way down. And that's just a quick and easy way to transfer the markings. If you're fine with tracing the lines on, please go ahead and do that, whatever is easier for you. But for me, I will avoid tracing lines at any cost. Now for your buttonholes and your buttons, we have these lines. So your buttonhole line, you're going to transfer onto the right front. And then the X for the buttonhole placement, you're going to transfer onto your left front. So you're going to need to make sure that you're looking at your pieces from the right side and transfer these markings properly. And I'm going to advise you to transfer the markings for your buttonholes and your button placement on the right side of your fabric. Also, for the squares and the circles, these are for your carrier placement for your skirts. If you are sewing the view that doesn't have carriers, then you don't have to worry about this. But when you transfer these markings, the squares or the circles based on the view that you're sewing, transfer these onto the right side of the fabric, because we're going to need to see these to help us place our carriers. Now for our prep work. And these are the steps that I like to take care of in advance so that when it comes time to sew these pieces into the skirt, they're already done. Starting with our pocket pieces. We're going to prepare the pocket pieces along the curved edge with a finishing technique of your choice. I have serged mine. You can do that, or if you like, you can fold under with a small or a narrow hem. So take care of all 4 of your pocket pieces. Then we're going to make sure that we prepare our waistband in advance. For those of you who are brand new and haven't taken my beginner sewing course, follow step number 13 to prepare your facing. What I have done is I've interfaced the facing back and the 2 front facings, and then I sewed them together by placing them with the right side spacing, matching the notches. And after I did that, I just finished off the raw edge, or press the seams open and then finish off the raw edge. And this is what it looks like on the right side. Okay, so take care of that step. Next, we're going to make sure that our lines for the carriers are transferred onto the right side of the fabric, because when we attach the carrier to the skirt, we're going to need to see these markings for placement. Okay, so you have 6 markings that you're going to transfer onto your carriers. Finally, I want you to finish off the raw edges of your 2 back pieces at the center back. First, we're going to sew together our carriers for the skirt, and I'm going to be demonstrating the wide carrier for view D, and this is what it looks like once we sew it together. If you are sewing views A or C, then follow along with the instruction sheet, steps 17 through 20. Okay, let's sew our carriers together. Okay, grab your belt, one of your belt carriers, and with the right side spacing, with your 6 markings on the right side, we're going to fold the carrier in half and pin it together. Beginning and ending with a back stitch. Okay, so we've sewn that seam in. We're going to trim the raw edge off, and you want to trim about maybe half of that seam off. Then we're going to turn the carrier with the right side out. And we're going to go to the pressing station, and you're going to press this flat with the seam along one end. Okay, you're going to press that flat and then come back here, and then we're going to baste the raw edges together. After you have pressed your carrier flat, we're going to baste the raw edges together, and you want to baste your raw edges within the seam allowance. So make sure you're just to the right of your seam allowance. And to baste, go ahead and set your machine to the longest stitch, and no back stitch when you're basting. So go ahead and sew from one end to the other. I'm going to do that on both sides. Then next we're going to take our seam allowance or our seam gauge, and we're going to turn in the seam allowance, which is 5/8 of an inch. So push your slider over to the 5/8 inch mark, and we're going to fold over and measure over to 5/8 of an inch. Okay? And once you have that, you want to go to the pressing station and you want to press this flat. Now that we've pressed over the seam allowance for the carriers, we're going to measure off up to 3/8 of an inch. So let's move our slider over to the 3/8 inch mark, and then I'm going to measure from the fold, and then I'm going to take my scissors and make sure you guys can see this. I'm going to take my scissors and snip right there at the 3/8 inch mark. Okay, and I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. At the 3/8 inch mark. Then I'm just going to open that out and cut straight across. And now we have a 3/8 inch seam allowance on our carrier. Go ahead and do that on all of your carriers and then set them aside. Now we're going to sew the pleats. And as you can see, I've transferred the markings for the pleats onto the wrong side of the fabric, and I've transferred the markings for the carriers onto the right side of the fabric. To sew the pleats, grab your pins, and we're going to draw these two lines together and stitch along the line. Okay, so draw those lines together, and I'm going to start pinning at the top edge. So make sure that those lines are matched up on both sides, and then pin. Make sure you check the other side to see that the pin comes out on the line, and if it does, go ahead and pin. Then I'm going to go down to the corner and insert my pin right at that corner where the lines meet, and then turn it over to make sure that you hit the corner. And I'm off just a little bit, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to back that pin out on that layer of fabric only, and then I'm going to move it over until I hit the corner. And then we're going to pin in place, and we're going to check to make sure that on both sides that our pins are lined up on that line. And then we're going to go to the machine and we're going to sew a stitch from the top to the bottom. Okay, and we're going to do the same thing with this pleat and all the other pleats. Okay, we're going to insert our fabric under the presser foot so that the stitching line is lined up with the needle. So we're going to center this fabric right at the center of our presser foot. And if you need to, use your hand wheel to make sure that it's in the proper place. And our pleat is sewn in place. You're going to go ahead and do the same thing with all the other pleats in your skirt fronts and the skirt backs. Okay, to press our pleats, we're going to first press them flat. So here I have my pleat line stitched in. I'm going to make sure you use a press cloth so that you don't ruin your fabric. And then we're just going to give it a burst of steam. I'm going to do the same thing with the other pleat. Then we're going to take the pleats, let's open out the skirt. And we're going to take the pleats and we're going to fold them over toward the center front of the skirt. And don't worry about these folds, I'm going to show you guys how I did that. So let's take the pleat and fold it over toward the front, making sure that the raw edges are even, okay? And then we're going to do the same thing with the other pleat, but first we're going to press that in place. Let's take our other pleat and we're folding it over right along that line, making sure that the raw edges are even. And press. Now we're going to sew a basting stitch across the top edge where we've created the pleats to hold the pleats in place. So I'm going to take a pin to pin it in place, just to hold it down. Then we're going to insert our basting stitch. Let's sew within the seam allowance. I don't sew my basting stitches on the seam allowance. And you actually don't have to remove your basting stitch if you're sewing it within the seam allowance. It's totally up to you. Okay, so we have our basting stitch sewn in. You're going to do that with all of your pleats. Next, we're going to insert a top stitch on our pleats to hold them down. We're going to start at the top and we're going to just stitch close to that folded edge all the way down to where the stitching stops for the pleat. And you will open up your pleat where it ends and take a pin, and we're going to insert a pin right there so that we will know where to end our stitching. And the same thing for the other pleat. Open it out, locate where the stitching ends, and insert a pin. Now, if you have an edge stitch foot, that is a perfect presser foot to use to insert your top stitching, because it has a guide and it helps you to get a nice even stitch from beginning to end. I'm going to use my all-purpose foot because if you don't have one, I like for you to see how it's done with the all-purpose foot. Also, if you have an overcast foot, I like to use that one. It works really well. So what we're going to do is start at the top, and you're going to position your fabric, the fold of the fabric, just to the left of your needle, and you will use your hand wheel to turn down to see where the needle is going to hit. So you're going to make sure that it's close to the edge, but not, so close to where it's going to fall off of the edge. So lower your needle and your presser foot, and then you're going to have to be careful that you're sewing a straight stitch and that the distance is the same from that folded edge all the way down. And you can use whatever point of reference you want. Like for me, I'm going to use the edge of this clear plastic. I see how much of that fold is inside of that clear plastic, and I'm going to try to keep that even all the way down. Okay, let's begin. And just take your time to make sure that you're getting a nice even distance from that fold all the way down. And as you come up on the pin, remove it. I'm going to go down one more stitch. Oops, I went two. Leave your needle down into the fabric, lift your presser foot, and we're going to pivot the fabric to the right, and then we're going to lower that presser foot, and we're going to stitch over to the edge of the fold. And for me, with the distance that I used to sew my, or to top stitch the pleat, I'm going to go over just one, and then I'm going to back stitch. I'm going to go forward once again and another back stitch. And there you can see I have a nice even line of top stitching. You're going to do the same thing on your other pleat and all of the pleats that you've inserted into the skirt fronts and the skirt back. To press in the fold, if you have transferred the markings from your tissue paper onto your fabric, the long lines, then you will just use those lines as your guide to fold your fabric over. If you've chosen to use my method and you have snipped at the top where those lines begin, then what you're going to do is find your snip, fold your fabric over, and make sure that your fabric is even along the raw edges at the top. Then you're going to take your seam gauge and you're going to measure from the raw edge over to the fold. And you're going to keep doing that down the length of your first fold. And then you're going to give it a burst of steam. Okay? Then you will continue folding over and measuring down the length of the first fold and pressing all the way down to the end. Now when you get down to the bottom at the hem, you're going to find that snip. You're going to fold your fabric along or right on that snip, again making sure that the raw edges are even. Measure again to make sure that it's the same width from the top all the way down to the bottom, and then go ahead and give it a press. Now for the second fold, you're going to do the same thing. If you've drawn in lines, go ahead and follow the lines. If you've snipped your fabric, then fold over on that snip, making sure that the raw edges are lined up evenly. Use your seam gauge to measure and use that as a guide to measure all the way down the length of your fabric and press. I want to bring your attention to the instruction sheet for those of you who are following along. Step 3, if you open out your fold, step 3 has you to invisibly stitch this raw edge down onto the fabric after the first fold. So they say to press over the first fold and then use your hand needle and thread to sew this down invisibly so that the thread doesn't show on the other side. Well, I have intentionally skipped that step because in my opinion it's not necessary, and I will avoid hand stitching wherever I can. But for those of you who enjoy hand stitching, please, by all means, don't allow me to take that joy away from you. Go ahead and hand stitch, and it's fine, but I'm going to skip it. And what I'm doing is, as you saw, I folded over both of the folds. After we have pressed in the folds for the placket, you can take a pin, a straight pin, and pin that in place, insert it in between the layers so that when you're working with it, you don't stick yourself. or you can use a basting stitch and baste this down. Okay, we can set our fronts aside and move on to the next step. Okay, I want to bring to your attention what the back will look like after we sew in our pleats. So I've sewn in the first two pleats, but you will notice there is another pleat, but this time we only have two lines, and it's at the center back where we've finished off the raw edge. The reason it's that way is because we're going to form the pleat after we sew the other back, or the other back piece to this one, and we're going to take them and we're going to place them together with the two, or with the right sides facing, and we're going to pin those into place, making sure that the lines are matching up on both sides. So I'm going to insert my pin, and then I'm going to turn it over to make sure that I'm in line. And it's a little bit off, but I'm not going to worry about it. It's fine. So we're going to pin all the way down the length of the skirt, and then we're going to go to the machine and we're going to attach the backs together at center, and then I'll show you how we're going to sew in our pleat. Okay, let's insert our fabric, and I'm sewing from the bottom hem up to the top of the skirt. That's just the way I like to do it. Okay, we have our center back sewn together. You're going to go to your pressing station, and you're going to press this seam flat. You're going to press it open all the way down, and then we're going to come back here and I'll show you how we're going to sew in our center back pleat. Now we're going to go ahead and pin our pleat. We're going to do the same thing we did for the smaller pleats, but as you can see, this is a much wider pleat. We're going to take these two lines and draw them together and pin in place. So we're going to line up those two lines and pin into place. And we're going to go down to the corner and pin. Again, checking on the other side to see if you've hit it, and I hit it perfectly. Yes. And pin that in place. Then we're going to go to the sewing machine, and we're going to sew a straight stitch from the top edge down to the corner. Okay, we've stitched our pleat. We're going to go ahead and give it a press to seal in the stitches. Then we're going to open out the skirt. Okay, we have this flap here. This is the pleat after we sewed the seam in. What we're going to do is we're going to take this center back seam, we're going to open it up, and we're going to match it to this seam right here, this center seam here. So make sure those lines are even and lined up with each other. And then we're going to press that down, and we're going to make sure that the raw edges are even along the top on both sides. Okay? Then we're going to pin that into place. Then we're going to go ahead and give that a press, making sure that we're nice and even along the top and that we're nice and even right along the fold. Okay? Now, I'm going to make sure that I'm not pressing on the pins because these have plastic heads. And you can actually remove them after you have your press cloth in place, unless you're using glass head pins, which are okay to press over. Okay, I'm going to give that a burst of steam on that side. I'm going to come over to the other side, give it a burst of steam, and I'm going to go in the other direction. This is just a little extra that I do. Okay. Our pleat is pressed into place. I'm going to go ahead and pin that to hold it in place. Then we're going to go to the sewing machine and we're going to baste across the upper edge. Then we're going to top stitch on the right side. Okay, let's go to the sewing machine. Okay, we're looking at the right side of the center back of the skirt with the center pleat created. Now we're going to insert a basting stitch. Make sure you keep those edges even. Okay, the next step is we're going to insert top stitching on both sides of this center seam where we created the pleat for the back. So change your stitching back to a 2.5 and we're going to start on the right side of the center seam. And we're going to top stitch the same way we top stitched the other pleats. And remember, we're going to stop right where this pleat opens. And you can actually see it better on this side, but I'm going to go ahead and put a pin here anyway so that we know where to stop. Remove your pin. I think one more. Lift your presser foot and pivot. Now I'm going to reinforce the right side. I'm going to stitch over one. Oops, I went too fast and I stitched over 2 or 3, I believe, but I'm going to back stitch and still secure it. It's okay. All right. Now I'm going to go forward 2 stitches and go over to the other side. Lift the presser foot and pivot. And here we have our top stitching done on the center back pleat. Okay, we are looking at one of our front pieces, and this is the side seam, and we're going to attach the pocket piece. We're going to line up this raw edge along with the raw edge of the skirt side. Okay, and we're going to line up the notches and pin all along the edge. Okay, then we're going to go to the sewing machine and we're going to sew in a stitch. Okay, this time we're going to use a 1/4 inch seam to attach the pockets to the skirts. Okay, after you have attached your pocket to your skirt, it's up to you whether you want to finish off the raw edge or not. I'm going to finish off the raw edges of my pockets and skirt sides because my fabric, as you can see, it frays a lot. And even though this pocket is going to be enclosed and you won't see it, I still want to finish it off. And I'm going to finish it with a serge. You can use whichever method you choose if you're going to finish off your edges. And I'm going to serge all the way down from the pocket, from where the pocket is attached to the bottom of my skirt on the side, the raw edge. Now that we have our pocket sewn in place, we're going to press the seam flat. Then we're going to open out the pocket, and I'm going to flip it over to the wrong side. And we're going to press the seam toward the pocket. And we have our pocket attached. You're going to do the same thing to the other skirt front and your skirt backs, and then we'll move on to the next step. Okay, now we're ready to attach the skirt fronts to the skirt back, and we're looking at the skirt back at one side edge with the pocket attached. We're going to take one of our skirt fronts, and with the right sides facing each other, we're going to place those two together. Lining up the raw edges around the pocket. And we're going to pin that into place, making sure that the raw edges are even. And when we come down to the part where the pocket ends, make sure that your raw edges on the side of the skirt are lined up before you pin. Then we're going to continue pinning down the side of the skirt. Okay, starting at the bottom edge of the skirt, let's insert our fabric and begin sewing. Now we're coming up to this X. What you want to do, let's remove that pin, is you're going to keep sewing all the way up to the X. Then we're going to backstitch. Then I'm going to lift my needle, lift the presser foot, and I'm going to pull the fabric or push the fabric down to the next X here, the marking that we placed on the fabric. Okay. Then we're going to begin sewing here and sew all the way to the end, beginning and ending with the backstitch. Then we're going to go and sew the pocket together at around the side edges. I'm going to start right here in the corner. You're going to start right where the side stitch is. Use your hand wheel to find that spot. Okay, and begin sewing. Okay, we have our pocket and side seam sewn in. Now we're going to go ahead and go to the pressing station to press these seams. Oh, actually, before you go to the pressing station, we're going to need to clip the skirt back. Okay, we're going to clip the back right here at the seam allowance, because we're going to press the pocket towards the back of the skirt, and we need to clip at the seam allowance right here where the pocket ends, but only on the skirt back. Okay, so let me make sure I'm in the frame. On the skirt back right here where the pocket ends, you're going to clip up to the seam but not through it. Okay, and then we'll go to the pressing station and press that seam. I have gone ahead and pressed the seams flat, so you go ahead and press your seams flat around your pocket and along the side seam. Then we're going to open out the skirt. And we're going to take the pocket and we're going to turn the pocket toward the front of the skirt. All right, lining up the raw edges. We're going to press down this side seam and that fold where we left a space open for the pocket. We're going to press that flat. And we're going to press it just up to where we clipped the back seam. Okay, then we're going to move down to the side seam. Okay. Finger press that open before applying the steam. Okay, continue pressing all the way to the end. Then we're going to go back up to the top and making sure that your raw edges are even. We're going to pin the pocket down to the skirt front. Then you're going to go to your sewing machine and insert a basting stitch at the top edge. Then we're going to move on to the next step. Okay, now we're ready to attach the facing to the skirt. We're looking at the front of the skirt, and this is our facing that we prepared in the prep work stage. What we're going to do is, starting at one of the side seams on the skirt, you're going to take the side seam of the facing and pin that down to the skirt. Go over to the other side seam and do the same thing. And I like to pin down both seam allowances to keep them flat while I'm sewing. And then you're going to go in between and pin the front facing or the back facing in place. Then we're going to go over to one side. And remember, when we folded or pressed in the fold, we pinned it, or some of you may have basted yours. If you pinned it, just remove the pin. If you base stitched, remove the basting stitch. And then we're going to open it out, only one fold. And remember, you have the snip here. You're going to, or you may have the line if you traced it, turn the facing over on itself so that the right sides are facing. Okay? Then we're going to take the facing for the skirt. Actually, let's pin that in place just to hold it down. Then we're going to take the facing and we're going to match the notches. Pin that down. And then we're going to make sure that we open up the facing for the skirt and place that placket flat. And we're going to lay the facing on top of the placket. Okay? And then go in between and pin. And you're going to do the same thing on the other side. Okay, let's go ahead and stitch our facing onto the skirt. Okay, we have our facing attached to the skirt. The next thing I want you to do is I want you to trim about half of the seam allowance off. Go to your pressing station and I want you to press your facing out away from the skirt. Okay, so what you're doing is you're pressing the seam allowance toward the facing. Okay, to stay stitch or understitch the facing onto the seam allowance, we're just going to insert our fabric, and you want to sew a seam as close to the fold or the seam here where we've attached the facing to the skirt. Okay, we have sewn in the understitch. Then what we're going to do is we're going to fold it over. Okay. And you're going to go to your pressing station and press this facing into place. You're going to turn it and push out the corner. Then you can use your point turner to push out that corner and give you a sharp edge. Okay, and then there's your corner. you're going to go to your pressing station, make sure you press that flat, and you're going to do the same thing across the entire length of your waist. Okay, to install the carriers, we have our 2 marks on the bottom and the 2 marks on the front. And then on our carrier, we have our 2 marks here on the bottom, and we folded in our, or folded under the carrier on the top. So we're going to take the 2 marks on the bottom, and we're going to line up the 2 marks here right along with those marks, matching them up, making sure that we're in between these 2 pleat lines, and we're going to pin that into place. Okay. Alrighty. Okay, we have the carrier sewn onto the skirt at the bottom edge. We're going to flip it over and fold it up to the marks on the top, and then we're going to insert a stitch close to that folded edge from one end to the other. But before we do that, we're going to trim away this seam allowance here on the bottom. And we're leaving 3/8 of an inch, which is where that row of basting stitches, so it makes it easy for us to know where to cut it off. Okay, let's fold the carrier up and line it up with the marks here at the top and pin into place. And I did forget to mention, word of caution, you're sewing through a lot of bulk here, so I do recommend changing to a larger needle. I'm using a 90-14 to sew the carriers onto the skirt. So just a word of caution, a warning for you. And let's sew. And I'm sewing at a slower speed because I'm sewing through so much bulk, just an extra precaution to prevent the needle from breaking. Ask me how I know. And there we have our carrier attached. You're going to do the same thing with the other 3 carriers, and then we're going to sew our hem. Okay, to finish off our hem, we're looking at the placket. We're going to open it out 1 fold. Remember, we have 2 folds, and then we're going to fold it back onto the skirt with the right sides facing. And you want to make sure that it's folded right where that clip or the line is that you traced onto your fabric. All right. Then we're going to pin that into place. Then we're going to measure up 2 1/4 inch. That's the hem allowance, 2 1/4 of an inch, and we're going to place it under our presser foot. And I'm going to measure right from here and line it up with where the center of that presser foot is, where the needle is going to hit. And I'm going to remove the seam gauge. And if you need to, you can place masking tape or some type of guide here to help you stay even. It's a short distance, so I'm not going to use a guide. I'm just going to sew straight across. Make sure that your raw edges are even, and we're going to sew that seam in. Okay, then we're going to trim away a square of the facing only. We're not going to trim away the skirt, just this facing. So we're going to take our scissors and insert the scissors inside, making sure you're not cutting away the skirt, and we're just going to cut over to the edge. Then we're going to open that up and just cut it away. And this is what we have. Okay, now what you want to do is go ahead and finish off the raw edge of your hem with whichever method you are using. After you have finished off the raw edge, you're going to take the self-facing and turn it in to the right side or inside of the skirt, and that's going to turn your hem up along the bottom edge. You can take your point turner and push out the corner, and you're going to go to your pressing station, and using your seam gauge, you're going to press up your 2 1/4 inch hem along the length of your skirt, and then come back, and then we will sew in our hem. After you have pressed up your seam allowance, this is what it should look like. Now we're going to turn it over to the right side, and we're going to insert our hem, or we're going to sew in our hem. I'm going to be using the edge of my needle plate as my guide. You will need to create your own guide. Again, you can use masking tape or whatever you decide as a guide. So let's go ahead and sew in that seam. And there we have our hem sewn in place. Okay, and the last thing you're going to do to finish off your hem is you're going to whip stitch this portion of your hem down to your skirt. So with a hand needle and thread, just go ahead and sew that down to secure it to the hem. Okay, I'm going to be using the automatic buttonhole foot that came with my Baby Lock Soprano to sew in my buttonholes. And first I'm going to open up a chamber in the back, and this is where you place the button, and this will measure the size or the length of your buttonhole. So you secure that in, and then I'm going to attach it. Okay, now I have marked my buttonholes, and what I'm going to do is insert the fabric, and this right where the needle falls, I'm going to insert the fabric to this point, not at the edge where the fold is, but it starts down here, and then it will sew up and then come back. So I'm going to insert my fabric at this dot closest to me. And what I'm looking for when I line up my fabric here in this opening is there is a red dot right here on the buttonhole foot. I'm lining up my marking with that buttonhole or with that red marking, and that lets me know that I'm centered. Then I'm going to use my hand wheel to turn down and make sure I'm in the right spot to start that buttonhole. I've set my machine for a buttonhole stitch. I'm going to lower the buttonhole lever here and make sure it's in back of the white tab on the buttonhole foot, and I'm going to begin sewing. Okay. And there is my perfectly sewn buttonhole. Okay, the quickest, easiest, most efficient way that I have found to open buttonholes is using this buttonhole cutter set. It has made my buttonhole opening life so much better. So what I do is first I will use fray check. I will dab a little bit on the front and the back of the buttonhole, and that helps to prevent it from fraying after we open the buttonhole. Then I will take the mat that comes with the cutter and place it under my buttonhole. And then I will take the cutter, and what we're going to do is we're going to place it inside of the buttonhole and just rock it back and forth. Okay? So I'm going to start at this end, making sure that you don't place the blade onto the threads. And then I'm just going to press down and rock it left and right. Then I'm going to move down to the other end. And same thing, rock it back and forth. And you will feel it and even hear it cutting through the fabric. And then there, our buttonhole is open. I love this set, and I think you will too. You'll find it in my Amazon store. When you go there, just click on the cutting tools page and you'll see the buttonhole opener set there. Once you have finished sewing your buttonholes, on the other side of the skirt front, you can go ahead and attach your buttons using the markings that you placed onto your skirt. Before we move on to sewing the belt, you're going to need to attach your hook and bar closure. The hook will attach to the side with the buttonholes, and then you'll attach the bar to the side with the buttons. So you go ahead and take care of that, and then come back and we'll sew the belt. Next, we're going to prepare the self-tie belt if you're sewing view D. You're going to take the two pieces for your belt, and with the right sides facing each other, you're going to line up the notches. Oops, I have mine upside down. You're going to line up the notches and pin this edge in place. We're going to go to the sewing machine and just insert a straight stitch. After you have sewn in the seam, press your seam allowances open, and then we're going to fold our belt right sides together and pin together along the length of the belt. Okay, we're going to start our stitching right here along or at the fold. So insert your fabric and start stitching. Then we're going to lift the presser foot and pivot. I need to go one more stitch. Okay, and then continue. We're going to pivot. We're going to trim our seam allowance. all the way down to the other end at your corners. You want to come in and snip off that point. A quick tip, when I am trimming and I have an opening that I need to turn inside to whip stitch together, when I get to the point where the opening is, I will cut, instead of trimming away the seam allowance down close to the stitching on either side of that opening, I will clip it out at an angle and then go to the other end and clip at an angle. And then I'll continue trimming. And the reason I do that is because when I turn the fabric, I hope you saw that, when I turn the fabric right side out and I am folding in the seam allowance, I want to have something to work with rather than having this small amount of seam allowance. I need to have something to work with, and having that flat makes it a lot easier. After you have trimmed away all of your seam allowance and clipped away the thread at the opening here, go ahead and turn your belt right side out, and then you're going to go to your pressing station and press your belt flat. You are pressing it so that the seam allowance is on one edge and then the fold is on the other edge. Okay, then you will be able to whip stitch this opening closed, and your belt will be ready to insert into your carriers. Well, that's it for today. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have enjoyed this video. If you have, please hit the like button. And if you have not subscribed to my channel already and you like what you saw, there is a lot more coming. And I invite you to become a subscriber. And when you do, make sure you hit that little bell to the right of the subscribe button so that you will be notified when new content is posted here to my page. I would also like to extend an invitation again to join my private email community. The link is in the description box below, and by doing that, you will receive exclusive content that is not released to my blog or here on YouTube. You will be able to participate in exclusive giveaways and a lot more. I want to ask you that if you are sewing this skirt and you are on Instagram, that you please use the hashtag when you finish sewing your skirt, because I want to see what you guys are making. I want to see what you come up with. If you will please use the hashtag Sewing with Anita. Yes, hashtag Sewing with Anita. And if you're not already following me over there, then I am at Anita by Design on Instagram. There will be a new sew along coming after this one. I'm not sure when, but if you're part of the private email community, then you will get notification of when the next video will hit and what you will need to have in advance to be ready to sew as soon as the video releases. We're going to be sewing, of course, another skirt. So join me over there. And again, thank you for watching this video. I'm going to go and put on the skirt, style it, and give you guys some pictures. And until then, until next time, until I see you next time, remember, as always, when you live in your design, it is from there that God shines. That means when you live according to the way that you have been created, it is from that place that God will use you to bless other people. I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.